Hey guys, it's Konrad Bobilak here, CEO of Investors Prime Real Estate and author of Australian Property Finance Made Simple. Welcome to today's video. And today's video is all about research and due diligence. And I know a lot of you are going to be doing research in 2020 and getting your first investment property, and some of you will be adding to your current property portfolio. So I thought I'd make this video about the top 10 things that are absolutely essential in a suburb for you to be aware of in order for you to make an intelligent decision whether it's an area to invest in or not. Now, I've got to tell you, there's hundreds of different ways you can make money out of real estate investing. You know, there's subdivisions, there's developments, there's options, there's buy and hold, buy and sell, there's granny flats, there's cash flow positive, there's cash flow negative, growth properties. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. What I'm talking about here specifically is for those of you who have a buy and hold long-term strategy where you're market reliant and you want capital growth in the suburb. So this is definitely made for you if you're doing some research. Personal disclaimer. My results aren't typical. I'm not going to insult your intelligence by promising you or implying that you're going to build a multi-million-dollar property portfolio like I have, but I'll show you exactly what works for me and others. Give you some pointers on how you can implement similar strategies in the event that you find them congruent with your risk profile and investment time horizon. Let me know. I'd love to hear your success stories. And this video is more designed to save you from making mistakes, because mistakes in real estate are very costly, guys. Usually they're tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So to make sure you get the right information before you choose that investment property, and especially for those who are starting out for the first time. Now, if you haven't heard my story before, I'm not going to bore you to death, but I have done a lot of things in the last 25 years. I'm a real estate agent, a mortgage broker, ex-mortgage broker. I don't do mortgage broking anymore. And I started off with financial planning for Australian Unity Funds Management. I've got a diploma in financial planning, but my passion is that I'm a property investor in Melbourne with a multi-million-dollar property portfolio, and I'm in the market all day long, talking to other investors, sourcing property for clients, talking to successful property investors, talking to developers. So I've got my finger on the pulse, so to speak. And look, it took me 20 years to develop this research methodology on how to correctly identify areas that have outperformed the rest of the market. It's very easy in Melbourne and Sydney to get an average property that's average performing, but it's very challenging to find an area that's outperforming the norm. And I'm talking about areas that are growing at 10% plus per year, which means they double every 7 years. I'm also the author of Australian Property Finance Made Simple, which you can buy at any bookshop, Amazon, or bookonfinance.com.au. So let's get into it. Let's talk about what factors really determine capital growth in Melbourne, because it's not distance from the city so much, and definitely not transport. What it is, and I want to simplify this, is I call it a lifestyle triangle, and it's actually the time it takes to travel from home to work, from work to school if you've got children, or to lifestyle areas like cafes, restaurants, etc., and then back home. So it's the actual time it takes for you to drive to these distances. So for example, the number one growth suburb in Melbourne is Kew, and Kew has gone up by, an average house in Kew has gone up by an average of $200,000 per year for the last 25 years. I know it sounds ridiculous. People in Kew tend to work in Kew, and they tend to have the kids going to schools in Kew, and you've got some of the best schools in Melbourne in Kew. So if you're home, you live in Kew, and you drive for 5 minutes to work, you could be an accountant working in the business park of Kew, and then you come home from work and pick up your kids from one of the private colleges in Kew, and then you're 5 minutes back home, you're going to be very happy. Your quality of life is going to be very good. This applies to regional areas as well. If you're living in Bendigo, great regional centre. Your kids go to North Bendigo Primary School. I've just made that up. I'm not sure if there is a North Bendigo Primary School, but I'm sure there is a primary school in Bendigo. And then 5 minutes to work in the city, which is Bendigo's a regional town, so obviously there's no peak hour traffic. And then home in 5 minutes, your quality of life will be very good. Now, if you're living in Pakenham, for example, and your work is in the city and you have to drive, and you're driving for an hour and a half to the city, and then your kids go to a school that's another hour away, and then it takes you 2 hours to get home, and you're spending 3.5 hours a day in the car, which is an extreme example. I'm sure no one's doing that. Your lifestyle won't be very good quality because you're spending so much time in the car driving and being stuck in peak hour traffic. So this is how you can measure the distance or the time factor that it takes to get to from home to work to school or lifestyle centres, and people will pay a premium for the convenience of having a very short commute time between these three things. Because the most important thing for you to understand is that in Melbourne, very little people, bad English, there's not many people that actually work in the city. People assume that everyone in Melbourne works in the city. They actually don't. And this is what's very important to understand, because many people are surprised to learn that nearly 3/4 of jobs in Melbourne are located more than 5 kilometres from the central business district in suburbs. So 3/4 of people that live in Melbourne that work do not work in the central business district. 75%, 25%. Another surprise is only 20% of those suburban jobs, are located in medium to large activity centres. So if you look at Melbourne, these red sections represent the major job hubs in Melbourne. And you've got Tullamarine Airport, obviously. Now this section here is all blue collar to a large extent, and this is all white collar, apart from Clayton, which is blue collar and industrial. But these eastern suburbs and Bayside, these are business parks, this is all white collar jobs. So most people that live in the eastern suburbs and the Bayside don't actually work in the city, they work here in business parks and they work white collar jobs. So the quality of life is the highest in Melbourne, hence these areas have the highest capital growth. But we want to dig down further to work out why these areas are growing more than any other area in order to arrive at the 10 most critical things that you need to be aware of before you analyse a suburb. The other 80% aren't sprinkled throughout residential areas in standalone developments, although some are, definitely that is the case in some, rather than mostly located in relatively small centres. For example, we want Melbourne 2030 curiously calls major activity centres. So if you look at where the jobs are in Melbourne, it's interesting because they're here, but if you look at something in more detail, you can see that Clayton is one of the biggest hubs. And then you've got Tullamarine Airport, obviously. Kew and Hawthorn, have a look at that. Box Hill, St Kilda, Moorabbin, Heidelberg, Malvern, Bayswater, Dandenong, Footscray. So people live and work in these suburbs. So that's why these areas have good capital growth, because they have a good quality of life, because the lifestyle triangle is very short in terms of time it takes to drive from, say, for example, Ringwood. You know, so you can be working in Ringwood, you live in Ringwood, and your kids go to school in Ringwood, which is really cool. But definitely distance to the city is definitely what Melbourne and Sydney are priced at if you really generalise. Because we can see here, for example, this is house prices, the average house, Melbourne and Sydney combined. If you look at Sydney, for example, 2.4 million. And that's 0 to 5 kilometres from the central business district, and that's the median price. So any property within Sydney, within 5 k's of the city, is about 2.482 million. In Melbourne, it's about 1.568 million, which is the difference is 37%. The moment you get over that 5k radius into the 10k radius, there's a discount of the median price of 6%. And 3% for Melbourne. So the further you get away, look at 10 and 15, negative 27%, negative 19. So the further you're away from the city, the median price, there's definitely a correlation between the median price of suburbs. Now yes, this is a very general approach to investing. It's not simply which, distance to city, because obviously there's different parts of the city. In Melbourne, the eastern suburbs are much better, for example, in the Bayside and in the south than the west and the north. There's no comparison in capital growth or money. Same in Sydney. I mean, you've got the North Shore, the eastern suburbs, and you've got the western suburbs, So there's difference in capital growth. Look what you hit when you hit 25 kilometres, 50% discount in Sydney and 46% in Melbourne. The further you go out, in terms of capital growth potential and price, the cheaper it gets. Now, there are exceptions, like Don Vale Park Orchards in Melbourne, 35, 40 k's from the city, $2-3 million median price. But this is just a very general approach. I just wanted to show you the psychology behind this because you've got to be aware of it. So obviously in Melbourne, the dark patches represent the most expensive suburbs, and in the lighter patches, the cheapest suburbs. You can see definitely there's a strong correlation between the distance between the city and the price of suburbs, and this is 1.4 million plus for the dark patches, and then you got the yellow and orange between kind of 400 and 800. So you can see there's a graduation away from the city, and then you got Williamstown, obviously, you know, and as you go through, it gets cheaper and cheaper and cheaper. You definitely have pockets out there as well, you know, of different suburbs. I mean, Sydney's a little bit more complicated because you have, it's geographically landlocked in every direction, but you've got definitely, you know, the North Shore, and then you've got the eastern suburbs. We can see there's obviously a graduation where you have a concentration of very expensive suburbs, and then as you go this way, you're getting cheaper and cheaper as you go further away from the city. And also because these are newer estates as well. This is the older part of Sydney, and these are newer estates, relatively speaking. So let's get into the top 10 things. Number one, capital growth. 10 years, what's the capital growth? Bentley East, nice area in Melbourne, nice average suburb, top 50 to invest in. 12 months growth, 8.8. 10-year average growth, 10.36 from RP data. So it's a very good price point. That means it doubles every 7 to 8 years. If you look at, for example, an area I would never invest in, which is Point Cook, for example, you have 12 months growth, negative 2.33%, and then you have 10-year growth, 4.85. Inflation is about 3.25. So you've got very little growth there occurring, which means, and nothing to do with lifestyle areas, but guys, you can be living in Point Cook and you might have a very strong community there and you might love it there. I'm purely talking about capital growth potential. Would you prefer, if you're looking at two term deposits, because you've got to be detached, would you look at 4.85%? If you had to park your money, and remember you've got limited resources, you can only borrow so much money based on your income. So if you had two term deposits you're comparing, 10.36% as a return, or would you go for 4.85? I mean, it's obvious where you park your money for the highest return. You know, it's completely non-emotional. And these are stats from January 2020 from RP Data CoreLogic, okay? I don't make up these stats, by the way. I've got better things to do with my time. Well, I don't need to. It's all there. You know, you can just source this information very quickly from RP data and various sources. So that's number one. Number two, I'll look at average household income per individual. So for example, in Melbourne, the highest income per individual is Cremorne, which is Richmond, $2,537 per week. Now, the average Melbourne weekly income is $574 per week. So this is virtually 5 times more per week per individual than the average person makes. So Richmond, East Melbourne, Port Melbourne, Middle Park, Toorak, Elwood, Albert Park, St Kilda West, Clifton Hill, South Yarra. You can see that even in South Yarra, the average person makes $1,800 a week. Well, the average person in Melbourne is $574. So therefore, our target areas that have the highest income per individual, because this is where wealthy people live with discretionary income they can use to pay for property and bid up the prices at auctions and pay above market. Where do you get this information from? From id.com.au as one of the sources, or you can go for census data if you have a few hours to spare and play around on the government website. So ATO also has numbers on income, but census data is usually the best. It's just very difficult to navigate through. ID is a better option for that information. Number three is demand for housing combined with critical shortage of stock, which is DSR ratio, which is demand to supply ratio. And you can get that information by going to dsrdata.com.au. So for example, in Bentley East, Bentley has a DSR of 64 out of 100, which means that it has more demand. Demand is higher than supply, which means it's easy to sell your property, easy to get a higher price than you originally purchased your property for. If demand was lower, that means it's oversupplied. An example of that is East Dockland South Bank, for example, in Melbourne, oversupplied with apartments. So make sure you have DSR at least 65, 75, the higher the better, obviously, because then it eliminates your risk if you're trying to get out of the property and get into another property. Walk score. Let me ask you a rhetorical question. Would people pay a premium for the ability to walk conveniently out of their property and access cafes, restaurants, transport, schools lifestyle centres. Absolutely. So there's an international measure of the walkability factor of a suburb called Walk Score, which is simply walkscore.com. And this is a heat map of Melbourne showing you the most walkable areas in Melbourne, which are the green spots. And you can see that there's pockets within suburbs that are quite good. Like, for example, Dandenong is very good for walkability factor. You can walk out of Dandenong Plaza and there's hundreds of cafes, restaurants, lifestyle centres. Places like Croydon, Lilydale, Ringwood, Balwyn, Eltham. So it doesn't need to be in a city. It doesn't need to be Windsor, Toorak, Melbourne, Carlton. It can be in hubs as well. So this is the walkability factor. The higher the walk score, the more conveniently the suburb is equipped with things to make life easier, such as cafes, restaurants, shopping, schools, transport, access to the city, trains, buses, trams. So if you look at walk score, for example, in Melbourne, when this was captured, South Yarra was nearly 100 out of 100. So at a 5 minutes walking distance in South Yarra, you can access 100 restaurants, 6 of the best schools in Melbourne, trains, trams, buses to the city, etc. The lowest was Hallam. If you walk out of Hallam, you walk out of your house, within 5 minutes walking distance, you're nowhere near a coffee or a shop, you're just in front of someone else's house. So this is not the best way to measure the capital growth potential of a suburb, but it's definitely one of the contributing factors because people will pay a premium for convenience. And you can see there's a strong correlation between these suburbs having the really good walk score compared to others in terms of ranking. And 1 to 25 rank in Melbourne, you can see these pockets here are the highest ranked pockets in Melbourne for convenience, which is very important to know. So for example, there's a project that I sourced in Vickery Street in Bentley, which is a 2-bedroom townhouse, walking distance to Centre Road, which is 3 kilometres of shops, which is probably the best shopping strip in Melbourne, in my opinion. And Vickery Street is just there, hundreds of shops and cafes, and it has a walk score of 93. So basically you can walk to Coles, Woolies, cafes, restaurants, 24-hour gyms and come back without driving anywhere. You can walk to the train station, you can get to the city. You don't need a car basically in Vickery Street in this particular project, number 14 Vickery Street. So this also gives you like a map of all the amenities and there's all the best schools as well. And this is also in the McKinnon High Catchment area as well. So a very good thing to be aware of when you're researching suburbs all around Australia is be aware of the walk score ranking of the suburb, which is really cool. Number 5 is ranking of the best secondary schools, and these are both public and private. So if you look at a heat map of the best highly ranked schools in Melbourne, once again you can see the red patches represent the best pockets of schools and where they're located, and once again you can see the pattern. It's pretty much predominantly eastern suburbs, the Bayside area and the inner south, southeast and the inner east. But there are examples as well, like for example in Balmoral, there are very good schools in Balmoral in Melbourne. So there are other pockets around Melbourne that are spread, but predominantly it's all here. So obviously the highest rank, so where do you get the information from? bettereducation.com.au, results/VCE. And that gives you the highest ranked schools in Melbourne. This is a visual map as well. You can see that the blue ones represent 100 out of 100. You can see that there's definitely the concentration is here in Melbourne, which is all around the eastern suburbs and the Bayside and the inner south, southeast. And if you look at the schools, independently, you got Melbourne High, 100 out of 100, which is in the city. McRob's, which is in South Melbourne, 100 out of 100. And these are scholarship-only schools, by the way. And then you got, for example, and by the way, these schools don't need to be in. This is a combination of public and private schools. Obviously, some you pay 30, 40 grand a year, some are free. But they are purely based on ranking. Now remember, people send their kids to very exclusive schools, not so much for the VC results, because that's available everywhere in Melbourne virtually. They send them there because they want the kids to network with other rich people and other rich kids. So that's why people send the kids to St. Kevin's, for example, or Scotch College, not so much for the ranking, because there's plenty of public schools that are higher ranked, I should say, than St. Kevin's and Scotch College. But you can see that there's definitely a pattern, in terms of the ranking of the schools. If you go through all the different suburbs. You know, you can see this is 99. Canterbury, Brighton, Kew, Canterbury, Toorak, Hawthorn, Armadale, Keilor East, Ormond. Definitely you've got Berwick, you know, you've got Werribee in there as well. But once again, this is a combination of public schools and private schools. So here I would take out all the public schools and be purely focused on private schools for capital growth. But definitely schools, very sought after at the moment. If you look at the 97,000 people that came to Melbourne last year, immigrating from overseas, there was a big portion of them from India and China. What do those families value? Education. And they're going into the best school zones, depending on their income and what they do. They value education far beyond anything else. This is why we came over from Eastern Europe in '85. My family valued education virtually and freedom beyond anything else. So you have to understand every decade has a flood of migrants coming in from similar areas. If you understand where they're coming from and what the value system is, then you can start targeting different areas and suburbs that are catering for those people's needs. So basically find out what people want and give it to them. Number 6, buy investment properties in suburbs that have the most sought after shopping strips consisting of trendy cafes, fashion shops, beautician parlours and gymnasiums. And here you haven't got a particular tool because it's such a broad category, but you can read about it on domain.com.au and places like that, which have articles featuring the capital growth implications of areas that have very strong access to lifestyle strips. So what are the main ones in Melbourne? You know, definitely Central Road in Bentley, Lygon Street, you know, Brunswick Road, even Fitzroy Street in St Kilda. Iconic places like that, you know, give you access to cafes, restaurants and lifestyle areas. Number 7, never buy investment properties in the suburbs which have lending restrictions imposed on them by financial institutions, banks and lenders, mortgage insurance providers. Did you know that lenders blacklist postcodes based on what's happening there at any particular point in time? Now, mainly these blacklisted postcodes are for apartments. So, for example, in Victoria, you look at the postcodes of 3000, 3004, 3005, World Trade Centre, South Bank, South Yarra, Docklands, South Melbourne, and South Melbourne as well. These are the areas that are blacklisted for apartments where the banks will only lend you 60%, 70% LVR, maybe up to 80% maximum if you're lucky. So these are the areas that I definitely would avoid because the banks and the financial institutions are telling you that there is an oversupply of properties of a particular type of property in those areas. And by the way, South Melbourne is very bad for apartments because it's oversaturated, but it's very good for townhouses and houses. So if you can afford to get a townhouse and house in South Melbourne, buy one. I mean, it's going to be phenomenally good because land is so scarce. But definitely I wouldn't buy an apartment there because there's too many of them on the market. So just be aware, wherever you are in Australia, especially in mining towns, there's a lot of renting restrictions imposed on areas, which means you might not be able to get all your equity out of your property. And that means you're stuck with equity, locked up in your property permanently, not being able to leapfrog from one property to another, which is something that I teach with investors of how to create deposits in your property and then go again and again and again, because you can't save yourself to wealth, you've got to leverage yourself to wealth. Number 8 is buying investment properties in suburbs with the highest level of development and redevelopment restrictions are imposed in areas by local councils. These suburbs have height restrictions, density restrictions, heritage overlay restrictions, and single dwelling covenants on the land blocks. And this is a very interesting point because in areas, there are definitely suburbs in Melbourne where there's no lending restrictions at all and there's no development restrictions. And the council wants you to basically rip down every old property and redevelop it into a brand new property. This is not a good area to make money unless the area is going through gentrification. So for example, there are councils like, and I'll throw some suburbs at you in Melbourne, you'll know if you're from here, Heidelberg Heights, Heidelberg West is going through gentrification. Ex-housing commission area going into brand new townhouses and houses. Council's very pro-development, very easy to develop there. Another area is Footscray West, right? A lot of development, gentrification happening right now. Another area is Coburg to some smaller extent, because it's already happened to a large extent. Altona Beach and Newport as well. Gentrification happening in that suburb. But because it's happening there en masse, there's always new stock on the market. What you want is an area where there's massive demand from high-income demographics, but there's no future supply being built because there's so many restrictions. And that is St Kilda West, North Melbourne, East Melbourne for townhouses. Areas like Albert Park, Middle Park, right? You can't build anything in Albert Park, Middle Park. Try building something. It's all heritage protected, height restrictions, density restrictions. Try building something in St Kilda. Impossible. You know, you'd be waiting for years, fighting VCATs, fighting every neighbour, fighting objection groups. So therefore, if you have high-income demographics wanting to live in St Kilda and there's no stock being built because of all those restrictions imposed, that creates pressure on stock and pressure on capital growth. So seek those areas out around Australia, especially Melbourne and Sydney, where you're looking at very old suburbs, usually 100 years old, that are iconic suburbs, but there's so many restrictions on them, you can't build anything anymore in those suburbs, and that's where you have the highest capital growth. So definitely worth considering. Now, where you go to get that information, you have to go to your local council and town planning websites, which are very unique because obviously every council, every town planning department has their own planning website and council website. So you just got to do your research, and depending on the area that you're investing in. Buy investment properties that are designed by award-winning architects with high level of fixtures and fittings that appeal to the 29 to 35 younger professionals with high income earners. And this is very important because if you look at who's spending a lot of money on things that they want to show off, cars, jewellery, and property is no different, it's the younger professionals. Because they love having friends over, they want to show off. Hey, we've got this townhouse that we bought, and FK Architects are the architects. Really, FKA, yeah, amazing. So brand names, people pay, I'm fortunate to have a brand name, anything, whether it's a car, piece of clothing, a watch, whatever it is, people pay a premium just to say that they've got that particular brand. And real estate's no different, and HIA, in fact, has awards every year that are given to the best architects in Australia for designing properties. Now, just so you understand the difference between architecturally designed townhouses, this is architecturally designed, okay? You can see that paneling, the cladding. These are townhouses in Balaclava. They're super unique, super uber chic, as they call it. Very kind of industrial, new, almost a warehousey kind of a deco feel about them, which is really cool. This is what everyone builds. Okay, if you're a builder out there right now or an architect, stop building this shit. Okay, no one wants these properties. Our suburbs are littered with this crap, and they look sad the moment they're built. I don't even know where this comes from. I mean, in Europe, no one builds crap like this. Like, what was it that you were not thinking? I mean, it's like a 5-year-old. I'll do a house, and there's a roof, and there's a window. Stop building them. Okay. This is what we want in our suburbs, and it doesn't need to be modern, okay? This is what we want. This is what makes suburbs look phenomenally unique and exclusive. And in fact, and rather than this stuff, which is every suburb 25 k's from the city in Melbourne and Sydney, just littered with this stuff. Now, yeah, I source them, I sell them. They're cheap and big, people rent them. No one really, questions it. But I just think we're lowering our standards. And if you're a developer, spend the money to get a proper architect. Don't be tight. Number 10, holding costs. You want to buy an asset that's not bleeding you every week. And this is one of the biggest things that I look for. Not only capital growth, which is obvious, and the rental yield, depreciation on the property and fixtures and fittings, which diminish your holding costs. I want to make sure that clients are buying properties where it's not having any impact on their immediate lifestyle and especially their pocket. That means you buy a townhouse for $1 million, the 10 and a taxman are covering all your expenses, and it's cash flow positive for you by $10 a week. Perfect property, right? Because you're getting 10% growth. So think about it, $1 million, you're getting 100 grand in growth, and then you're getting $10, $15 a week because there's no holding costs at all. And between the taxman and the tenant, everything's getting paid. So make sure that you find properties that have very high depreciation schedules on the fixtures and fittings and the build as well, rather than focusing on properties that are 20, 30 years old with no depreciation on the building and no depreciation on fixtures and fittings. And that's why I target brand new properties, because you can reduce your holding costs substantially. It could be the difference between $150, $200 a week negative versus cash flow positive. And that's purely just depreciation on the fixtures and fittings and building. So definitely I will look for that. So they're the top 10 things that I would look for when I'm looking at suburbs. And if you look at the top growth suburbs in Melbourne, you know, like eastern suburbs like Mont Albert, Balwyn North, Middle Park, which is based obviously Port Phillip, Mont Albert North, Ashburton, Balwyn, all these 10% growth suburbs, they have all these things in common. They have the best schools, they're very difficult to develop in, very high walk score, very high income per individual per household, and they're well located, very close proximity to the city and the water, and obviously, unless they're in the eastern suburbs, of course, and obviously they have high demand combined with no land being available. And obviously the opposite is true for areas that are the cheapest suburbs in Melbourne as well. So what factors really determine property prices? It's not so much location, as everyone keeps saying, that determines capital growth. It's actually scarcity, which means limited supply because of all the points that I mentioned before, combined with high demand by the right demographics, people with very high disposable weekly incomes who are willing to pay above market, that determine capital growth potential over a long period of time because they push up the property prices. Richmond is the number one example in Melbourne. Highest income in Melbourne. Richmond is super expensive and they're tiny properties. And I don't even like Richmond. I used to work in Richmond in the X building on Church Street when I was at Medfin. Hate Richmond. I don't even like driving through Richmond. It's a dirty little suburb. Yeah, it's got good coffee. I can make coffee at home. I don't care. It's my least favourite suburb in Melbourne. It's got nothing going for it. But I think it's one of the best top 10 suburbs to put your money in. In terms of living there, you couldn't pay me enough to live in Richmond. You know, it's a filthy area. There's drug addicts everywhere. I wouldn't even let my kid go down the slide in a public park in Richmond without having disinfected the whole public equipment on the playground because it's so filthy. I know because I used to work there for years. I used to park cars there, have the wonderful coffee that Richmond has to offer. I get it. I know why people live there, but not everyone has to like it, right? And this is the thing about investing, guys. I love Richmond to make money. Never live there, okay? And that's how you got to think of when it comes to property investing. Complete emotional detachment. Money is one thing, livability is something completely different. Interested in learning more? I hope you are. If you are, I'd like to personally invite you to attend my next live event, which is the Real Estate Investing Fast Track Weekend, which you can get the latest dates by going to this website, realestatefasttrack.com.au, and spend 2 days with myself and people like Cameron Fisher from Changing Places Real Estate and Stephen McClutchy from Loans Australia, where you'll learn basically over 2 days how to build, structure a multi-million-dollar property portfolio from scratch that has the potential to eventually replace your job income and give you the financial freedom and independence that you truly deserve for you and your family. Day one is all in a classroom environment where we cover predominantly finance and structuring your portfolio. Day two is really cool because we put you on the bus and we take you around suburbs and we do on-the-ground fundamental research and due diligence. So you get to learn all those 10 things that I talked about before in real practice, in real life. And that's priceless. I mean, once you learn that methodology, you can just go out there and look at property and start building your wealth. The event's free, by the way. There's no charge for it, but it is limited to 44 people only per month, and I do 10 of these per year, right here in my St Kilda office, and I'm speaking right now to you in my boardroom in St Kilda. And also, if you don't attend that, get a copy of my book by going to amazon.com.au or Book on Finance, and then you can pick up a copy of Australian Property Finance Made Simple, which has just become #1 bestseller. Also, if you don't attend the live event, I'd love to give you access to my free home study online. No strings attached, there's no upsell, nothing to buy, with $497. All you got to do is click on the link below, and it basically will teach you how to build a large property portfolio. It's super easy to use. You literally point and click and download your PDF manual, which accompanies the home study. Back in the day, we had DVDs. This is what it used to look like. Now, obviously, it's all digital download. No one has DVD players anymore, even laptops. don't have DVD players. Soon kids will be saying, Dad, Mum, what's a DVD? Anyway, to access that, all you got to do is click this link just down below and you get access to the information. It's about 13 hours of contents that you can start watching right now and getting educated on how to build a large property portfolio from scratch. That's it from me, guys. I hope you enjoyed this video. Definitely subscribe to my YouTube channel. And this is Konrad. I'll see you on the inside. Thank you very much.